The old auto shop had only one mechanic left, and every bank in town believed it would close before winter. When Grace Ellison walked in asking for a job, the owner barely looked up from the engine. "I do not need another employee," he muttered. "I need a wife." The entire garage burst into awkward silence. She almost walked away until she noticed the faded wedding ring still hanging from a wrench above his workbench. What looked like an outrageous joke was actually the first clue to a heartbreaking promise, and a secret that would change both of their lives forever. She had arrived in this quiet Montana town 2 months earlier with little more than a car full of boxes and the address of a cousin who had offered her a couch for as long as she needed it. The town was smaller than any place she had ever lived. A single main street lined with a hardware store, a diner famous for its cherry pie, a white-steepled church, and a handful of shops that had survived the slow decline of the surrounding ranches, and the mill that once anchored the local economy. She had not chosen it for any particular reason beyond the fact that no one here knew her name or the story attached to it. Rain had been falling on the small Montana town for 11 straight days. The kind of gray drizzle that soaked into wood and rusted through hope. Grace Ellison parked her aging sedan outside Brennan's Auto Repair, the only shop in 3 counties still known for honest work, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before stepping out. The building looked tired. Paint peeled from the sign above the bay doors, and the gravel lot held more potholes than cars. Yet through the open garage, she could see a man bent over an engine with the kind of focus most people reserved for prayer. Cole Brennan did not hear her enter at first. He worked with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms streaked with grease, a wrench moving in short, practiced turns. The radio on the shelf behind him crackled out an old country station, half static, half melody. And above it hung a row of tools so worn their handles had gone smooth and dark from decades of use. When he finally straightened and saw her standing near the doorway, he wiped his hands on a rag and said nothing, waiting for her to speak first. The way a man does when he has learned that silence saves time. Grace had driven past this shop twice already that week, circling the block once from nerves and once because her ancient sedan had made a noise near the courthouse that she preferred not to think about. She had applied to 19 positions since arriving in town 2 months earlier, and 19 times the answer had been the same polite, hollow silence. She was not strictly speaking qualified to work in an auto shop. She knew this, but the shop had a hand-lettered sign taped inside the window that simply read, "Help Wanted." And pride by that point had become a luxury she could no longer afford. She told him she was looking for work, her voice steadier than she felt, and he set his rag down on the fender of the car he had been working on, giving her his full attention for the first time. He asked if she could rebuild the transmission. She said no. He asked if she could diagnose a failing engine by sound alone. She said no again, though she almost smiled at the strangeness of the question. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, if she could keep books, manage invoices, track payments owed and payments due. To that, she said yes. And something in her voice must have carried more certainty than the rest, because for the first time he looked at her directly instead of through her. Even so, he shook his head. "I do not need an employee," he said. "Every dollar this shop makes goes right back into keeping the lights on." He turned back toward the engine as if the conversation had already ended, and Grace felt the familiar sting of another closed door. She turned to leave, gathering the last of her composure, when his voice stopped her at the threshold. "What I need," he said quietly, almost bitterly, "is a wife, not an employee." The words landed strangely in the cold air of the garage, and for a moment neither of them moved. A younger mechanic named Tyler near the back froze mid-motion, wrench suspended above a tire, clearly unsure whether he had heard correctly. Grace turned back slowly, expecting to find mockery in Cole's expression, but there was none. His face held no smirk, no invitation, only a kind of exhaustion so old it had settled into the lines around his eyes. She should have left. Later she would wonder why she did not. Instead, her gaze drifted past his shoulder to the wall behind the workbench where a single wrench hung from a nail, and looped around its handle was a thin gold ring, dulled by years of dust and motor oil. It was such a small thing, easy to miss, yet it explained everything and nothing at once. The younger mechanic in the back had gone very still, glancing between his boss and the stranger with the particular caution of a man who had watched other conversations in this garage go badly before. Grace studied Cole's face for some sign that he intended the remark as a joke, some flicker at the corner of his mouth, but there was none. His eyes had already drifted back to the ring's direction, though he did not look at it directly. The way a person avoids looking straight into a light too bright to hold. She understood, without yet knowing the story behind it, that she had stumbled into something private, something that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a grief still occupying the space where a family used to be. She did not ask about it that day. She simply nodded, said she understood, and walked back out into the rain, her shoes splashing through the flooded gravel, toward her car. Halfway there, she glanced back once, and through the open bay door, she saw Cole still standing exactly where she had left him, wrench forgotten in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. Something about the shop and the man and that quiet ring refused to leave her thoughts for the rest of the evening. She returned the next morning anyway. Not for a job this time, but because the drizzle had turned into an early frost overnight, and she had noticed while driving past that the shop's front step was cracked in a way that could hurt someone. She fixed nothing herself. She simply mentioned it, and Cole, surprised to see her again, offered her a cup of coffee out of some reflexive Montana courtesy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with manners. They sat on two mismatched chairs near the parts counter, steam rising between them, and for a while neither spoke. Outside, the frost had begun to melt off the windows in long, uneven streaks, and somewhere down the road a truck downshifted hard enough that Cole's eyes flicked toward the sound, out of habit, before returning to her. Then, perhaps loosened by the warmth or by the strange comfort of an unfamiliar face that did not ask too much, he began to talk. He told her the shop once employed 30 men back when the mill was still running, and half the county drove trucks that needed constant care. There had been 3 full bays then. A waiting room with real chairs instead of the 2 mismatched ones they now sat on, and a hand-painted sign out front that read Brennan and Sons, though the sons in question had never actually worked there. An old joke from his own father's optimism that Cole had never bothered to repaint. He told her about his wife, though he did not say her name at first, only that she used to bring lunch to the garage every day at noon, rain or shine, setting it on the same corner of the workbench where nothing else was ever allowed to sit. She had a habit, he said, of humming while she waited for him to wash up. Always the same 3 or 4 songs. And even now, years later, he could not hear those songs on the radio without his hands going still on whatever he was working on. After she passed, he said the shop had simply stopped mattering to him for a while. Though the bills had not stopped coming, and eventually he sold off 2 of the 3 bays just to keep the doors open. He let 2 of his best mechanics go, not because their work was poor, but because he could no longer afford to pay them. And something in the telling of it, plain and unadorned, made the loss sound heavier than any amount of dramatics could have. "I don't need someone to fix my books," he said, staring into his cup rather than at her. "I need someone to fix my life. I already know how. I just don't want to do it alone anymore." Grace understood then that his earlier words had never been a proposal, nor even really a joke. They had been a confession spoken by a man too proud to phrase it any softer. She did not answer directly. She only told him that everyone deserved a reason to go home at night, and that sometimes people built that reason with their own 2 hands before it ever found them. He looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether a stranger could possibly understand grief that specific, then simply nodded and changed the subject to the weather. She left that afternoon without a job offer, and without asking for one. But she came back the next morning, and the morning after that, arriving before the shop opened, letting herself in through the propped side door and working in silence. She dusted the office, a room so cluttered with unopened mail that the desk had become nearly invisible. Beneath a stack of unopened envelopes, she found a parts catalog from 4 years earlier. Its pages still creased at articles Cole had apparently once meant to read, and she set it aside rather than throwing it out. Sensing already that little in this shop should be discarded without permission, she organized years of invoices into something resembling order, sorting them first by customer, then by date, building a simple filing system out of second-hand folders. She bought herself at the hardware store down the road. She matched receipts to bank statements late into the evenings long after Cole had locked the bay doors and gone home, and began calling customers whose service reminders had gone ignored for months, apologizing on the shop's behalf for the silence, promising appointments within the week. Cole noticed, of course. He said nothing for the first week, watching her with a weary suspicion of a man who had been burned before by generosity that expected repayment. Arriving each morning to find some new corner of the shop restored to order without ever having asked for it, he tested her once, quietly, by leaving a stack of tangled receipts on the counter overnight. Curious whether she would tackle them or simply move around the mess the way everyone else eventually did. She had them sorted by the time he returned from a service call, and he never mentioned the test again. By the second week, the phone rang more often, its bell an unfamiliar sound in a shop that had grown used to silence. By the third, 2 regular customers who had drifted to a competitor across town returned, remarking that the shop finally felt like someone was minding it, that calls got returned now that appointments no longer vanished into whatever chaos had swallowed them before. She began negotiating with suppliers as well, calling around to compare prices on parts the shop ordered every week. And within a month, she had trimmed enough from the ordering budget to cover what would have been her own wages twice over, a fact she pointed out to Cole with the quiet satisfaction of someone proving a point without needing to say it aloud. She also began keeping a simple appointment calendar taped to the wall beside the phone, replacing the scraps of paper Cole had always relied on and occasionally lost. Still, when Grace asked about wages, Cole refused. "I don't want to owe anybody anything," he told her flatly. And she understood that his stubbornness was not about money at all, but about a fear of needing people, a fear sharpened by loss, until it had become something close to armor. It was only after Ruth Caldwell mentioned in passing that the shop's deposits had visibly improved over the past month that Cole finally relented, agreeing to pay her a modest wage backdated to her very first day, though he made her promise never to bring up the delay again. It was around that time that Trent Harlan first appeared, driving a truck too clean for a man who claimed to still turn wrenches himself. He owned the largest chain of repair shops in the state, 4 locations already and a 5th under construction 2 towns over. And he had heard the way men like him always seemed to hear things, that Brennan's auto repair was struggling. He walked through the garage with the unhurried confidence of a man used to being deferred to, running a finger along a workbench as though inspecting it for a purchase already decided. He offered to buy the shop outright, generously, he said, more than it was worth, laying a folded contract on the counter as though the matter were already settled and only needed a signature to become real. He talked about efficiency, about modernization, about how a small, independent shop like this one could not hope to survive against change with better pricing on parts and labor. Cole refused without hesitation, the offer barely finishing before the word no left his mouth. And he did not so much as glance at the contract Harlan had set down. Harlan smiled the practiced smile of a man unused to rejection, the kind of smile that did not reach the eyes. He said Cole would be out of business within 6 months regardless, and that pride made for poor collateral, then folded the contract back into his jacket as though he had merely misplaced it rather than been refused. Then he left his truck pulling out of the lot without so much as a wave. And within days, strange things began happening that felt too coordinated to be coincidence. A parts supplier who had worked with the shop for over a decade suddenly canceled the account, citing unspecified changes in policy, offering no explanation despite Cole's repeated calls. A shipment of brake components vanished somewhere between the warehouse and the shop. Never explained, never replaced, leaving 3 scheduled repairs stalled for a week. 2 long-standing customers mentioned almost apologetically that a new shop across the county line had offered them service at half price. Service that, as it turned out, came from Harlan's chain under a different name. A fact Grace uncovered only after cross-referencing the new shop's business registration with public filings late one night. The timing troubled Grace more than the individual incidents themselves. A canceled supplier account, a missing shipment, and a competitor's sudden discount could each be explained away separately. But arriving within the same 10 days felt less like misfortune and more like a plan carried out in careful sequence. She began keeping a small notebook of dates and events, a habit left over from her old career, one she had once used to track something far more dangerous than a rival mechanic's pride. Grace suspected sabotage before Cole allowed himself to consider it. She began tracking the pattern of cancellations, the timing of the missing shipment, the sudden interest of Harlan's people in the shop's supplier contracts. Cole dismissed her concerns at first, insisting that bad luck simply came in clusters sometimes, the way storms did. A man more comfortable blaming weather than accepting that someone might be working deliberately against him. But when a letter arrived from the bank threatening foreclosure over a missed payment, neither of them remembered missing. Even he could no longer explain it away as coincidence. Grace spent that entire night at the shop going through boxes of records that had clearly not been touched in years. Searching for the source of the discrepancy, the office grew colder as the hours passed, the old space heater in the corner rattling weakly against the chill, and she wrapped herself in Cole's spare coat, which still smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar, without quite noticing she had done it. Around midnight, she found the first error, a payment recorded twice under 2 different customer names. And from there, the threads began to unravel one after another. She found errors everywhere. Not fraud exactly, but the kind of quiet chaos that builds when a grieving man tries to run a business and a household and a life, all with the same 2 exhausted hands. She found unpaid invoices from customers who had simply been forgotten, money owed to the shop that no one had ever collected, some going back nearly 2 years. She found a tax refund from 3 years earlier that had never been claimed sitting untouched because the paperwork required to claim it had been buried beneath a stack of unrelated receipts. By 3 in the morning, she had covered the office floor with color-coded stacks of paper, a system only she could read, muttering numbers under her breath as she cross-checked totals against bank statements spread across the desk. By sunrise, exhausted but clear-eyed, she had assembled enough documentation to buy the shop several months of breathing room, enough to answer the bank's letter with facts instead of apologies. And enough, though she did not yet realize it, to change the way Cole looked at her entirely. When Cole arrived that morning, and saw the stacks of neatly organized paper, saw the numbers that suddenly made sense for the first time in years. He stood in the doorway of his own office for a long moment before he could speak. "Thank you," he said finally. The words rough, unpracticed, as though gratitude were a language he had not used in a long time. Grace only nodded, too tired to say much of anything. But something between them had shifted, something neither of them had a name for yet. Together, they drove into town that same afternoon to meet with Ruth Caldwell, who had run the local bank for nearly 30 years and had known Cole's family since before he was born. She listened without interruption as Grace laid out the corrected figures, the recovered refund, the newly collected invoices, occasionally nodding at a number that seemed to satisfy some internal calculation of her own. When Grace finished, Ruth removed her glasses, studied Cole for a moment, and said that she had never once doubted the shop's ability to pay its debts, only its ability to prove it. She agreed to extend the loan by 6 months without additional penalty, provided the shop continued submitting quarterly statements prepared to this same standard, a condition Grace accepted before Cole had even finished processing what had just happened. Walking back to the truck afterward, he admitted quietly that he had expected to leave that meeting with far worse news. and that he was still adjusting to the strange sensation of someone else carrying part of the weight he had carried alone for so long. Trent Harlan did not take failure well. He had built his 4 locations on a simple formula: buying out smaller competitors before they had the chance to recover. And Brennan's Auto Repair was the first shop in years to refuse both his money and his pressure. Colleagues who knew him described a man who treated every transaction as a contest he could not afford to lose. And the longer Cole's shop survived, the more that survival seemed to gnaw at him personally, as though its continued existence were a direct insult to his own success. He was not finished. Having failed to buy the shop and failed to starve it through sabotage, he turned to something uglier. He began spreading word around town, subtly at first, that the woman working for Brennan's Auto Repair was not who she claimed to be. He mentioned to anyone who would listen that she had once held a senior position at a major automotive corporation and had left under circumstances no one seemed able to explain clearly. The implication was obvious even without details. And Cole, hearing the rumors secondhand from a customer, finally asked her directly. Grace did not flinch, though her hands tightened briefly around the mug of coffee she was holding before she set it down. She told him the truth, plainly, the way she had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times without ever expecting to say it out loud again. She had been the operations director at a large auto parts manufacturer responsible for quality control across several plants spread across 4 states, a position she had spent 13 years earning 1 promotion at a time. When she discovered that a batch of faulty brake components had been knowingly shipped, despite failing internal safety tests she herself had signed off on requiring, she reported it through every proper channel available to her. First to her direct supervisor, then to the company's internal compliance office, then when both went silent, to a federal regulator. The company buried the report for as long as it could, then quietly maneuvered her out of her position within the year, citing a restructuring that eliminated her role, but strangely, none of the roles beneath her. They made certain, through channels she never fully traced, that no one else in the industry would hire her again. Her name quietly flagged in conversations she was never part of. She had spent the following 18 months applying to jobs that never called back, watching her savings dwindle month by month, selling first her car, then most of her furniture, until she found herself standing in a small Montana garage, asking a stranger for work she was barely qualified to do. I did the right thing, she said, and it cost me everything. I don't regret it, but I understand if that changes things for you. Cole was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she braced herself for rejection, her eyes fixed on the coffee cooling between her hands rather than on his face. He set down the wrench he had been absently turning over and looked at her directly, the way he rarely looked at anything that was not an engine. Then he simply said, I trust you with the same plain certainty he used when diagnosing a failing alternator, as though the matter required no further discussion. He added, after a moment, that in his experience, the people most eager to point fingers were usually the ones with something to hide themselves, and that he had learned long ago not to judge a person's character by the noise made around them. It was, Grace would later think, one of the most healing sentences anyone had spoken to her in 2 years, delivered without ceremony, by a man who clearly had no idea how much weight it carried. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them announced, but both seemed to understand. Grace began staying later than the work strictly required, and Cole began finding small reasons to ask her opinion on things he had always decided alone. Which supplier to trust, which customer's payment plan to extend, whether the shop should finally invest in a second lift. Neither of them called it anything. It simply became the shape of their days, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. There were small moments that neither mentioned aloud that both carried quietly afterward. Once when Grace burned her hand on a radiator hose she had insisted on helping remove, Cole took her wrist without asking and ran it under cold water for a full 5 minutes, his jaw tight with a concern that had nothing to do with liability. Another time she caught him watching her laugh at something a customer said, and when their eyes met, he did not look away first. which surprised her more than anything he might have said. Winter arrived in earnest not long after burying the town under snow that made the roads treacherous and the shop's business slower than usual. The bay doors stayed shut more often than not that season, and the two of them settled into a quieter rhythm, working through paperwork by the wood stove coal kept burning in the corner of the office. The smell of cedar smoke becoming as familiar to Grace as the smell of motor oil had once been unfamiliar. One evening, during a storm that knocked out power across half the county, Cole and Grace sat in the darkened office by the light of a single lantern, waiting out the outage together, because neither of them particularly wanted to drive home in the ice. Snow pressed against the windows in soft, insistent drifts, and somewhere outside a branch cracked under its own weight, the sound sharp against the otherwise complete silence of the storm. He told her in the quiet way men sometimes find their courage only in darkness, that he had meant what he said on her first day, more than either of them had understood at the time. He said the shop had never truly needed another employee. It had needed someone willing to build a life inside it, the way his late wife once had, filling the space between work and home until the two became indistinguishable from love itself. "I said I needed a wife," he told her. "I still think that's true. Not because I need someone to cook or clean or manage what I can't. I need someone who chooses to be here anyway, every single day, the way you already have." There was no ring in his pocket, no rehearsed speech. Only two worn chairs pulled close together in a cold garage, lit by a single lantern. The storm still rattling faintly against the windows outside. Grace did not answer immediately. She sat with the weight of the question, feeling the years of rejection and struggle and quiet loneliness settle into something that finally resembled possibility. A feeling so unfamiliar, it took her a moment to recognize it as hope rather than fear. She thought of the company that had discarded her, of the apartment she could no longer afford, of the long drive into this town with nothing but a trunk full of boxes and no plan beyond finding work of any kind. None of it had led her here by design. And yet somehow it had led her here anyway, to a cold garage and a quiet man and a question asked without flowers or rings or any of the usual performance. She did not say yes that night. She only reached over and took his hand, and for both of them in that moment, it was answer enough. Harlan's final attack came in early spring, sharper and more dangerous than anything before it. He arranged through connections Grace never fully traced for falsified documents to reach the state's tax authority, alleging that Brennan's auto repair had been underreporting income for years. Cole called Sam Porter the same afternoon the accusation reached him, his voice tighter than Grace had heard it since the day the bank's letter first arrived. Sam arrived within the hour, still in his work clothes, and listened carefully as Cole explained what little he knew that a formal complaint had been filed, alleging years of underreported income, and that a state inspector intended to visit within the week to review every record the shop possessed. Sam's advice was simple and direct. Cooperate fully, hide nothing, and let the numbers speak for themselves. Since an honest business with clean records had far less to fear from scrutiny than a dishonest one hoping to avoid it. Grace, listening from the doorway, felt a strange calm settle over her. The same calm she remembered feeling years earlier, the night before she filed her original report. The quiet certainty of someone who had, for once, already done the difficult work in advance. An inspector arrived unannounced, demanding records going back half a decade. Records that, thanks to months of Grace's careful organization, existed in complete and accurate form for the first time in the shop's history. She spent 3 days walking the inspector through every ledger, every receipt, every reconciled bank statement, laying out a paper trail so thorough that the inspector remarked, almost admiringly, that she had never seen a small shop's books kept this cleanly. Sam Porter, the lawyer who had helped Cole years earlier with a minor dispute over a lease, arrived on the second day to sit in on the remaining sessions, his presence lending a formality that seemed to unsettle whoever had filed the complaint in the first place. By the third day, the discrepancy at the center of the complaint revealed itself not as evidence of fraud, but as a clumsy fabrication traceable to a shell account connected. Through several careful layers back to one of Harlan's companies, Grace found the connection herself, tracing a routing number through public filings until it led unmistakably to an account Harlan's chain had used for an unrelated transaction 2 years earlier, a mistake careless enough to suggest arrogance rather than caution. The inspector's findings did more than clear the shop. They opened a formal investigation into Harlan's business practices, one that would eventually cost him 2 of his 4 locations and considerably more of his reputation than he had ever cost Cole. His name appearing in the regional paper under a headline far less flattering than any he had grown used to. Word of the vindication spread through town quickly, the way most things did, and customers who had drifted away over the winter began returning, some out of loyalty, restored, others simply curious to see the shop that had outlasted a man twice its size. Business steadied, then grew faster than either Cole or Grace had dared to hope. It was around that time that Cole did something Grace never expected. He sold his truck, the one vehicle in his possession he had always called irreplaceable. A restored classic he had spent a decade rebuilding piece by piece in the hours after closing. She assumed at first that he had sold it out of desperation, some final sacrifice to keep the shop afloat despite its recovery. She nearly said something to stop him before it was too late. But by the time she learned the truth, the sale had already closed. He had not sold the truck to save the business. He had sold it to buy the small house sitting empty beside the garage, the one with a sagging porch and a single bare window that faced the shop's back lot. A house Grace had walked past countless times without ever considering it more than another piece of the town's quiet decline. He walked her over one evening after closing, keys still smelling faintly of the hardware store, his boots crunching over half-melted snow, and told her plainly that he had not done it because he needed someone to cook or manage a household in his place. The house was small and mostly bare inside, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling of what had once been a living room. The floorboards creaking beneath their weight as they walked through room after empty room. Grace said nothing at first, uncertain what he intended by bringing her here, watching him run a hand along a door frame the way he might inspect a car he was considering buying, careful and deliberate. "I didn't buy this because I need a wife to run a home," he said, standing in the small, empty living room where dust still floated in the evening light. "I bought it because I want someone who leaves a light on for me. Not because she has to, because she wants to. I think that's you. I've thought that since the day you walked into my garage looking for a job I wasn't willing to give you." Grace, who had spent 2 years being told by the world that her integrity made her unemployable, found herself crying in a way she had not allowed herself in a long time. Not from sadness this time, but from the strange relief of being fully seen by someone who had nothing left to gain by pretending. She said yes before he had even finished the sentence, and he laughed. A short, surprised sound, she realized. She had never heard from him before. Their wedding, when it came a few weeks later, was small enough to fit inside the garage itself. Chairs borrowed from the diner down the street, flowers picked from Ruth Caldwell's own garden and arranged that morning in mason jars set along the parts counter. Sam Porter stood witness alongside a handful of regular customers who had, over the past year, become something closer to family. Men who had once come in only for oil changes and now lingered afterward simply to talk. The garage itself had been swept clean for the occasion, the concrete floor scrubbed until it shone, and someone had strung a line of small, white lights across the ceiling beams. The same beams that had watched Cole work alone through years of grief. Ruth cried more than anyone expected her to, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and muttering that she had known this shop through 3 generations of Brennan men and had never once seen it look so alive. There was no elaborate ceremony, no lavish reception, no string quartet or catered dinner. Only 2 people who had each rebuilt themselves from very little, standing amid the smell of oil and steel and fresh-cut flowers, choosing now to build something together instead of apart. A year passed, the way years do in small towns, quietly, steadily marked more by seasons than by dates. by the return of the mud in spring and the return of the frost in fall. Brennan's Auto Repair became, by most local accounts, the most trusted shop in the region. Its reputation restored not through advertising or expansion, but through the simple, stubborn consistency of good work honestly done. One customer's trust passed quietly to the next. Grace became co-owner in every way that mattered. Her name added formally to the business alongside Cole's on a new sign that replaced the old faded one out front. Her steady hand visible in every ledger, every scheduled appointment, every returning customer who trusted the shop with more than just their cars. She hired back one of the mechanics Cole had once been forced to let go. And slowly, one bay at a time, the shop began to look the way it had before grief had shrunk it down to what one man alone could manage. Cole no longer worked alone. In the evenings, the silence of the garage no longer heavy with grief, but filled instead with the ordinary sounds of two people building a shared life. Wrenches turning, radio humming low, the occasional laugh carrying out into the lot long after most other businesses on the street had closed their lights for the night. The small house beside the garage had slowly filled with furniture curtains and the particular clutter of two lives merging into one, though the porch still sagged in the same familiar way it always had. The old wrench still hung on its nail above the workbench. The faded gold ring still looped around its handle exactly where it had always been, untouched by the year of change that had swept through nearly everything else around it. One afternoon, a new customer, a young man passing through town on his way north, sat waiting for an oil change and let his eyes wander over the workbench while Cole worked. He noticed the ring and asked with the easy curiosity of a stranger who had no idea what he was asking about why Cole had never taken it down, especially now that he had remarried. Cole glanced at it for a long moment. The way a man looks at something that has stopped hurting and started simply belonging to his history instead. "I'm not taking it down," he said finally. "It reminds me that love doesn't end just because someone leaves. It just teaches you how to open your heart again a little wider than before." Grace, standing nearby with a clipboard in hand, walked over and took his hand without a word, feeling the same rough, familiar calluses she had come to know as well as her own. Neither of them needed to say anything more about the ring or the years before it, or the long road that had brought two broken strangers into the same small garage on opposite sides of hardship. Outside, the frost of the previous winter had finally given way completely, the gravel lot drying beneath a pale morning sun. And somewhere down the road, a truck engine turned over on the first try. A small, ordinary sound that once might have gone unnoticed, but now felt to both of them like a kind of quiet miracle. Together they turned toward the open garage door where the first mild morning of another spring waited outside. And their first customer of the day was already pulling into the lot, waving through the windshield at the two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, built something lasting out of very little.